And now it's time for Omniversica, the greatest show on the internet, with your hosts, Dan Schneider and Art Durkee.
This is the Omniversica radio show on Sursumcorda.com with two of the artistic mavens here, Dan Schneider and
Arthur Durkee.
And
who are you calling a maven?
we got the idea for the show a couple of months ago when Dave Wesley had me on to do a Sursumcorda radio hour and asked me if I wanted to do a show, and I didn't want to do it alone. I wanted to have someone as a bit of a fallback and another person to bounce ideas off of. And I've known Art for about 5.5 years, and I run a poetry group here in the Minneapolis area called the Uptown Poetry Group, and Art's been coming for about that long. And while I'm basically just a poet, Art is a man of many stripes. And I don't know, Art, if you want to tell a little bit about your artistic endeavors.
Actually, I'm a man of rainbow stripes, not just yellow stripes. So, just to be clear, yeah, I'm actually primarily a musician and graphic artist, and poetry is actually sort of my least functional medium. It's the one I practice the least, which irritates some people I know. Irritates Dan sometimes, I know. Mostly I've got, a couple degrees in music and a lot of experience in graphic design and photography and illustration, that kind of thing. I basically like to do it all. One of my heroes is Leonardo da Vinci, who did it all, and another one is Ben Franklin, who did it all. So it's just one of those, throw it all in the grab bag if it's creative, and I like to do it. It's fun.
Well, one of the things with this show is we want to do some things that we don't hear on regular radio, and I guess I divide radio into sort of three kind of genres. It's talk radio, top 40, and then like the NPR kind of news media. And I think all of them appeal to a lowest common denominator, and hopefully we won't.
I don't know. We'll see.
But in this first segment, I guess we'd like to introduce ourselves a little bit. And as I said, I'm a poet, and Art's a multidisciplinary artist. But Art, I know what little I know about you. You were born not in this country, and
actually, I was born in this country. I was born in Detroit, but my father was a medical doctor with the mission, and I grew up in India.
And you've also been a world traveler, Indonesia and other places?
Indonesia, Europe several times. Haven't been to Africa or Australia, though those are still on my list to do someday. But I've hit all the other continents. Well, actually, no, I haven't hit Greenland, actually. But that's okay. Greenland is cold.
And I'm just basically, I grew up in New York and moved out here almost a dozen years ago, and basically a city boy. So I know, Art, you said that poetry is like number 4 or 5 on your art list. What is the art discipline that you consider yourself, or I mean, if you wanted to be known in 50, 100 years as a photographer, a graphic designer, what?
I'd rather be known as a multidisciplinarian. I mean, that's one reason I like Leonardo and Ben Franklin. I'm also a big fan of John Cage, who was primarily known as a musician, though in many ways he was an inventor. He came up with new musical forms, but he also did like etchings and drawings and visual art, as well as radio art. I've done community radio for about 20 years, and I think that that's actually an art form. Broadcast is actually an art form, and people don't view it as a fine art. They view it as this kind of junk transistor radio talking or top 40 music thing, and it's really so much more than that. You just you don't run into it. So I don't know, in 100 years, if anyone remembers me at all, I would hope that they remember more than one thing, but I don't know what that would be. For all I know, the one that I practice the least attention to is the one that everyone will remember me for.
Yeah,
if at all.
Of the many things that as we've talked about and bandied about between us and Dave Wesley, the webmaster of Sursumcorda, ideas for doing, I know you're one of these people that sees the difference between religion and spirituality, and I know, are you a practicing Buddhist? Or?
I'm not really a practicing. I'm a practicing meditator.
Is there such a thing as a practicing Buddhist, or is that to practice it would to be to violate it?
Yeah, I guess it would depend who you ask. And certain Zen masters would say no such thing as practice, and others would say, sure, just sit down and shut up. You know, it's the whole thing about shut up and play your guitar, shut up and sit there and breathe.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Because I consider myself an agnostic, and basically things such as religion don't really intersect in my life. But I know when you listen.
Did you grow up in an organized religion, or
yeah,
your parents?
Missouri Synod Lutheran?
Okay.
But they weren't strong. My mother has never been terribly religious, and I think my father just did it to try to keep the kids on a straight path, kind of thing. I did go to a Lutheran school until 5th grade, and then the tuition, I guess, got too expensive for my working class folks. And
yeah.
I do remember I did get like a 6 or 7 year pin in Sunday school, but one of my claims to fame is that my Sunday school teacher, one of her, I won't say her name, but she came back one time from a concert from Engelbert Humperdinck, and 9 months later she was suing him for paternal support.
Uh-oh.
And it was quite a scandal at the school. This was back in, I guess 72, 73.
Oh my. Backstage pass, perhaps. I don't know.
But I myself, were you always artistic? Because
I've basically the course of my life has been to figure out. I've always been creative. I've always been a visionary and a mystic. The Lutheran Church kicked me out, or I left them rather, but it felt like being kicked out because. I grew up in Lutheran Church in America, but I left because they didn't know how to deal with mystics. They have no...
Well, when you say mystic, you mean capital M mystic? Because when people say mystic, they think of sort of like some Caribbean guy shaking a bone. And
no, it's not like, sitting out and doing the tarot readings. It's not one of those TV psychic things. No, I'm talking about people... they're going back centuries in all the world's traditions who were like shamans, and in the Catholic tradition there's this whole thing of medieval mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and Meister Eckhart, who are very, very much tied into the way real life is and the way the world actually works, because they have a direct contact with what they call God, and I don't have a word for that thing, but I've always had a close connection with that. And it was one of those... I've spent most of my life trying to express what that was, and most of my life trying to turn in verbal or artistic or visual or musical form the experiences I've had. When Photoshop was invented, I told everybody, thank God, at last I can finally show people through Photoshop what the world looks like to me on a daily basis. That was a lot of fun.
Well, I know with me, I was always good with words, although I didn't really have any idea about art. I mean, I thought growing up, poetry was kind of a pansy kind of thing to do. But then I remember when I was 18 or 19 and I got out of high school, there was this girl that I had lusted for 3 years. And I think it was a Phil Donahue show that I saw where some guy was talking about ways to romance women and said poetry. So I pulled out a Funkin' Wagnalls and just started from that.
So that was your inroad.
Yeah, but I mean, in looking back, I always was... good with words. I mean, when I was a kid growing up, I was always small and on the sickly side, so I was always good verbally with the older kids doing what would call rank outs, your mother, the dozens kind of thing.
Yeah, the dozens.
And I was always good at that, so I was always had a facility with words.
You write a lot of essays too, though. I mean, do you think of yourself first as a poet or as a writer, maybe?
A poet. I mean, the only reason, and just to get things on the table, the only reason I write essays is so that more people will look at the website and look at my poetry and other people's poetry. The only reason to do for me to want to do this show is that to expand and you want to get your name out there, because you and I both know that, especially in poetry, and I don't know as much.
It's true in music too.
Yeah, that you need to get a certain you have to have a certain kind of quality, a name quality, a name Q. What is it? The Q quotient or whatnot.
It's branding. It's recognition.
So that you can write on toilet paper and they'll publish it.
Right.
Because as far as poetry doesn't make money. It's never made money.
No.
And in in these days, unless you're a college professor and in the whole sort of NEA system, you're not going to get published. Walt Whitman couldn't get published these days, really, I don't think.
No, lots of good people from the past would never get published today.
So that's basically just to get it up front. I mean, while we want to do things differently. I mean, yeah. I'm not going to say this is a very self-serving thing that we're doing, and
that's honest.
Yeah, but I'm sure Dave is that way too, because I know Dave was in the music industry, and that's I'm sure why he owned a club and other stuff too.
I actually played one gig at your club. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it was fun. Enjoyed that. It was a good night.
One of the things that with the Uptown Poetry Group that where we met and we know a lot of people. I've always I don't think it's just my own kind of Ginsbergian try to push my friends, but I think one of the things with the Uptown Poetry Group is that we try to be basically honest, and if something sucks, people will say this sucks and try to be specific. And
if it's 90% there, then here's the one word you need to change to make it from an okay poem into a really good one.
Yeah. Now you say in other arts too that most of the kind of classic bullshit that goes on in poetry about not wanting to hurt people's feelings, I mean, that exists to that extent in all the other arts as you've seen?
I think so. In music, it's harder to determine because music is nonverbal by nature. It's one thing to talk about, a song lyric, but when you're talking about, and I'll have a lot more to say about this later, but it's one thing to talk about how music can be better than it is, but there's something about music that I can't verbalize and I can't explain in words, where the difference between a performance that's really maybe exciting, but doesn't really grab you, and then one that's like, oh my God, you'll remember this moment for the rest of your life. In terms of visual art, I think visual art is as ridden with mannerisms and cliches as writing, as poetry, as novels, as short stories can be.
But I mean, certainly people always point out that most of all art over the centuries has been bad,
Yeah.
But
right.
I've got a feeling that in the last 15, 20 years with technology, self-publishing, the internet, people being able to burn CDs, in studios like this one, that people, there's less of a willingness to say something in a negative vein critically because it depends. There's so much back scratching. I certainly in poetry publishing. But would that really be true in music as much? I mean,
I don't know that it's as true as in music. I know that it's true in terms of getting your music to deal with, getting not your music to deal with somebody, but getting a record label, say, to pick you up. There's a tremendous amount of don't step on certain toes going on. You piss somebody off when they come to hear your show, and then you're screwed. There's just a lot of that kind of political stuff that goes on,
But it can't be just in the arts, because I know one of the things that really at work the last few months, most of the people there listen to NPR, and on Minnesota Public Radio, there's a mid-morning show with this woman, Catherine Lanford, and whenever she interviews artists, I just cringe because she's constantly just kissing the ass, and you can hear her phony laugh when someone says something mildly humorous, but yet she has nothing to gain in the artistic system. So is it just political correctness? I mean,
I think it's habitual.
Yeah.
I think it's habitual. I think that people who consider themselves non-creative, which is a misnomer because everybody's creative. I mean, I know people who are the most creative people in the world, and what they do is basically stonemasonry, and yet it's just the most amazing stuff that they do. So there's a lot of people who think they're not artists or musicians or writers or creative because they're not published poets, or they don't have a CD out or something like that. And so they put people who they envision or that our culture puts up to be those wonderful genius types, they put them on pedestals, and then they don't think they can be with them or be like them or do what they do. So I think some of it is the habit of the cult of personality and worship more than anything else, rather than any aspect of quality per se.
Well, see, when you talk about creative, I mean, I think I've mentioned before, and I know I've written a couple of essays on it, I think there are three types of intellect: the sort of functionary intellect that's measured on IQ, the creationary, which most artistic types would be in, and then sort of a visionary, that which goes even further beyond. I don't know. I've always been kind of wary when I hear like everyone is creative. It's like,
well, maybe not to the same level, but everyone's creative somewhere and has some kind of creative aspect.
Sure, because I agree with that, but it's like people always talk about, there's an education crisis here in Minnesota. The newly elected Republican governor Pawlenty is constantly, there's an education crisis, and we need to get them up to this standard or that standard. But I mean, the world is basically maybe a C+ place, and to expect A's from people who are just C+. I mean, I love my sister, but she's not gifted. I love her, but
I grew up in a family where everyone was gifted, so it's sort of what I'm used to. My sister is an artist and had every form of visual art and sculpture my sister has either dabbled in or succeeded at, and now she teaches art too. My mother was a pianist, my father was a doctor but sang in church choir, so I think in some ways it's my viewpoint is based on that. At the same time, though, I've spent, when I was in music school and then just in college before music school, before I transferred, I did see a lot of people that I thought were more creative than they thought they were. So I tend to, it may not be that everybody is an A level, but maybe, this person over here, C+ compared to this person over there, well, maybe for them that's enough. I think sometimes we go on to this thing about things need to be always better than they are and always more perfect than they are. And sometimes I think, at least, in terms of, the arts, sometimes they're good enough. I don't expect everyone to be a great painter when I see them. And I don't expect even my favorite musicians. Some of my favorite musicians do not always deliver great stuff. They have their off days. I don't know, though.
How about, in poetry, certainly, especially with the rise of confessionalism in the late 50s, the stereotype of poets, and even going back to the Romantics, is, the tragic artist, and, whether that's Jackson Pollock or Sylvia Plath, or even going back to John Keats. And one of the things that I hope that over the course of months or however long we do this, is that some of the artists that we interview, whether they're people we know personally or people that we come in contact with, I want to get away from that idea that that artist is all about suffering and genius is madness,
and weirdness and being an eccentric and taking your dog to the grocery store because you're a fine artist or something like that.
Well, because I know I used to go to a local cabaret here for a few years ago, and there was this fellow that a really talented musician, or at least a real talented singer, but he was a typical kind of guy I still see him sometimes singing in the skyways, and those are elevated passageways here in Minneapolis for those outside the area, singing for a buck. And I don't know, a part of me bristles because a part of me, just wonders, what kind of mentality that is. That to me, it's like just waste. And I guess I grew up in a depression. Parents who grew in the depression area, and to waste your talent
you hate
like
to
that.
see the waste of that. I know. The thing is though, and I've seen this all the time in the music industry, and I know a few musicians in Wisconsin who will remain nameless, who basically, as soon as they approach a certain level of success, sabotage themselves. It's like, I swear there's some kind of psychological deep-seated root that they don't feel like they deserve success or can afford to be successful, and without getting off into some big kind of Freudian psychoanalyst trip, which I'm not really into. I do see people get that close and then they freak out and then they back away, and I wonder if this guy was one of those. I mean, I know a guy in Cleveland who has started at least 5 record labels over the last 10 years because every time he starts getting famous, he disbands the band, disbands the label, and starts over again. It's ridiculous. Yeah, he's brilliant.
I don't know which frustrates me more, people who have actual artistic talent and sort of fritter it away, or those people who are persistent and have none, Yeah, and the ones who are persistent and have none are often the ones who succeed, in my opinion, because they have the persistence to wear everybody down through relentless self-promotion and marketing to the point where you just you buy their album just so they'll get away from your front door. I know a guy in Madison who is a street musician who's terrible. He's just awful. He can't sing, he can't play, he can't even tune his guitar, and he's the most relentless self-promoter I know. He's famous all over Wisconsin as a result. Now I know, you hear stories all the time about like celebrities being stalked and stuff, and just on the internet with my website Cosmoetica.com and a few other things, I've had a lot of just nuts just harass me endlessly, as well as my wife. And I'm just wondering, what does that say about, people, I guess, want to be artists? Is it such a desperation to have to want to be known for something?
I think it's that same self-esteem crap. I really do. I think it's the same reason people decide to sabotage themselves, is that they all want to be, maybe their parents didn't love them enough when they were kids, and so this is their, I don't know, I'm getting into the analysis thing again. But there is I think a lot of people basically want to be loved or cherished or respected or honored or be praised, and there's this tiny little kid inside them that's maybe 4 or 5 years old that's not getting enough attention. So sometimes it's like the kid in the playground screaming just so somebody will notice them.
But I also see a sort of parallel between artists and religion. Two examples that stick out in my mind. About a decade ago, there was a local Unitarian society that I had gone to. They had a singles group, and I actually met my best friend there. But Unitarians are not Roman Catholics. They're not Bible Belt Baptists. They pride themselves on being, so-called liberal. And then recently, there's a local group that I went to for a couple of months that a local radio show host runs. And I don't know. I find parallels in that both people who want to join religious kind of groups, and it doesn't have to be a cult, but there's a sense of wanting to belong, and I don't know if artists want to just be in an artistic community. Like
a sense of recognition, you mean, or what?
I don't know. I think just to belong to something, and something that uncritically accepts, and maybe that's one of the reasons that a lot of people that come to groups, we've seen at the Uptown Poetry Group, people come, and I give them, a 5-minute thing. If you've gone to a local university writing program, or the Loft, which is a local place here that gives writing programs, you're not gonna, if that's what you're looking for, don't come to the group. But they all say they can take criticism. They come, someone gives them criticism, and they'll come, after 1 or 2 times at the most.
Yeah.
But I've often found religion is that way, and I just... Now, I know I had briefly broached earlier, the difference between spirituality and religion.
Yeah.
Do you have some kind of difference? To me, religion, spirituality is a kind of wonder to me, a kind of feeling that there's more beyond the surface. And I would say that to me is the limit of what I would call spirituality, whereas religion seems to be always codified. Something is codified. You have to follow these certain precepts. Mm-hmm. And I naturally bristle against that, because I don't think any one human being has
got all the right answers or right paths, you mean? Or
and I've seen that, and in many faiths, and one of the essays I'm going to read later is a couple of years ago I had encountered this Buddhist fellow in Stillwater, and I had an interesting conversation with him, and Buddhism was sort of his family business, and I'll read that a little bit later. But I know, like, Western intellectuals always seem to always be fascinated with Eastern thought, and East is good, West is bad, and I think I think it's a specious analogy.
Yeah, and I think it's equally specious to do the either or thing. I think you really have to do a both and thing rather than an either or. For me, religion is a word that I use to describe the organized religions, the ones that have been around, that have a lot of people, and that they have dogmas and orthodoxies. And if you believe this, then you're one of us. If you don't, you're not. The milder ones say, well, that's okay. The nasty ones say, if you don't believe it, we're either going to kill you or you're going to go to hell when you die anyway. Those people are a problem, regardless. Spirituality, I like your definition of it. I use the word mystery with a capital M, because there's a lot of things beyond what I'll ever understand or ever know that I can sense, and that I have a feeling, and occasionally I get glimpses and visionary experiences and things like that. So there's this huge, gigantic world, but I'm aware that I'm only aware of probably 10% of reality, and there's another 90% that's out there that's just way beyond my comprehension. So I feel very connected to that, and I feel that's what I use to describe my own spirituality, basically.
Was your spiritual ideas, did they evolve in tandem with your artistic yearnings, or?
Actually, I think that they're deeply connected. I don't think it's an evolutionary process. I think they're always there, and I just learned to figure out how to talk about them. I think the creative aspect is fundamental to the spiritual aspect. They're so intertwined, I can't really separate them. I'm aware that I've studied all the world's religions. I minored in anthropology and folklore in college, and I've studied everything I could find about pretty much everything. I even read more Catholic theology than most Catholics I know, for example. And I find that there is a common core of experience that I think people all over the world have, and that's probably available to everybody if they let themselves go there. And a lot of mystics call that higher consciousness or the experience of enlightenment, or pick a term. There's so many words for it. And I find for myself that I see that commonality, but then people try to talk about it, and that's when the cultural differences come in, and the languages come in, and the semantics come in, and that's frequently where things get skewed. And then somebody who has not had that experience, but would like to have it, or whatever, they start cementing the dogma in, and then it turns into this codified system, and that's when a religion is born versus a spiritual experience. And that's frequently when things start getting really bad and crazy, and things get into trouble that way.
I've often thought that religion is almost like the first kind of brand names that there are. And one of the things that I know, I recently read this book recommended by my friend Joe called Religion Explained by Pascal Boyer, and I thought it was about maybe a 60 to 80 page thesis, really stretched out to 350 pages, and I'm going to eventually write an essay about it. Basically, his conclusion that I could determine was that religion is very complex, which it took about 330 pages to go to get to that point. But religion is something that I don't think you need to. I mean, to be good at art, you have to practice it. And I mean, people can have all the talent in the world, and there are people I know that have had as much or more raw talent than I do, but you need to work at it.
Yeah, they haven't developed the craft and the technique, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's where I think an artistic bent and a spiritual philosophical bent would differ, because you don't really need, I don't think, to practice.
Actually, I think you do. For me, I spend the first thing I do every morning after getting out of bed is this: I do some spiritual practice. I do meditations. I do certain exercises for myself, and they're ones that I've learned and acquired over the year. And these actually, I find, open doors. So I do believe that spirituality can be practiced and improved and become more facile, just the same way that artistic craft can. So maybe that's just my experience, and I don't know if it would be true for everybody, but that's what I think anyway.
Well, I know, Art, the other day you had sent an email, and I had asked you, maybe if you want to read that on the air in the next minute or two, regarding your views on art, and so I don't know if you want to get that out. And
yeah, sure. This is Arthur Durkee. Recently, I've been having an online discussion with some friends who are fellow musicians about the nature of music versus entertainment, art versus entertainment. We got started on a long discussion about what is basically, we could call it wanking, which is the slang British term for masturbation, as in musical masturbation. We all know the types. People get up there with their electric guitars and just go nuts for way too long, and it is sort of like goes, well, that's nice. I'm glad you can play notes that fast, and gee, I wish I'd rather heard some real music there. Anyway, so I'm going to dive right into this essay that I wrote on the topic for a while, and it's fairly long, so I'm going to only read part of it. Anyway, in my experience, the degree to which technical virtuosity and emotional depth overlap is precisely the difference between an impressive, good musical performance and one that is memorable, great performance. I do believe that it's possible to differentiate between the two. I feel that, in fact, it is easy to reach discernment on this issue. Given that it is a subjective evaluation, emotional content is easy to determine, so you can ask yourself this simple question: did the performance move you? If it makes you feel nothing on the emotional plane, then the answer obviously is no. If a performance moves you or touches you or makes you feel something, you notice how all those words and kinesthetic terms, are centered in the body and in the gut. Then it contains some emotional content and depth. If a performance is exciting in its brilliance and virtuosity, the technical question is answered. But if it evokes no response beyond that, or beyond a simple intellectual appreciation, well, that's a big clue to the nature of the emotional depth. The key element to discern is to trust your own feelings. Be in contact with your emotional self and listen to what it's telling you. Do not use your intellect to second guess your first responses, and trust yourself. As an example, I often cite the case of two flutists who were very famous on the world scene in classical music in the 20th century, Jean-Pierre Rampal and James Galway. Rampal was one of the greatest flautists of all time, technically, simply brilliant, and recorded a lot of different sort of styles of music as well, not just classical. But his performances frequently left me unmoved. Galway, on the other hand, was not as brilliant a virtuoso as Rampal and probably could not play nearly as well, but his performances were often contained an element of human warmth and feeling that Rampal's did not. For another example, one of the greatest jazz recordings of all time that I can think of is the duet between singer Tony Bennett and pianist Bill Evans. Just voice and piano, utterly simple in execution. These are performances that linger in the memory and that do not lose any impact on repeated listening. There's emotional depth there. Such experiences can give clues to where emotional depth exists and where it does not. And I think that's one of the areas that we can determine where the difference between art and entertainment is. For example, you could compare Yo-Yo Ma's two different recordings of the Bach cello suites. One made fairly early in his career as sort of an obligatory, I'm a great cellist, I have to record these pieces sort of recordings. And the other, released about 4 years ago, called Inspired by Bach, which was made much later in Ma's career. Yo-Yo Ma himself has said, and I agree, that the second group of recordings are far better performances because of the greater life experience that he brought to their interpretation and performance. So, there's a lot of things one can say about wanking, but I think it's a mental and musical attitude and approach to playing that emphasizes flash over substance. Bottom line, all forms of egotistical musical creation, including ego rock, are what I call wanking, and so are some classical albums I've heard. Speed metal is definitely wanking, in my opinion. I remember an ad in the back of Bass Player magazine some years ago where some player was saying how he could teach you how to play exactly like he does at over 32 notes per second. And my response, after laughing, was to think, well, that's nice, and who cares? Most of Paganini's music and some of Franz Liszt's show pieces in classical music are also wanking. And sometimes the way that people play Bach is actually wanking too. The way most folks play Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor, you'd think it was wanking, because it's being played as a big showpiece on a bombastic level. Now, a friend of mine who's a musician recently said something along the lines of, there would probably be a test of non-wanking musical honor that would work like this. Has your composition been so good that you can stand there and look pompous and do your thing and still come out with musical integrity intact? I think this test is likely to prove a reliable one over time. Some of Frank Zappa's stuff, for example, the G-Spot Tornado piece from his Jazz from Hell album, transcends the whole wanking label because I agree the music is so very, very good. Personally, I would never have called Jimi Hendrix an ego guitarist, or Zappa either. Sure, there's ego present. If there were no healthy ego present, no one would ever have the strength to get up on stage. But every time I see or hear Hendrix's performance on recording, I still feel it's all about the music, not about a neurotic display of the cult of personality. Nor would I say that wanking is always a bad thing, either in its musical or in its original meaning of the term. I think the problem is one of balance, and there are certain genres of popular music that are more prone to wanking than others because of the cultural baggage associated with them. So anyway, it has been asked, if a singer then And this overlaps with the wanking concern a little bit, but now we're moving towards the difference between art and entertainment. And you can use a capital A for art and a capital E for entertainment from here on out if you'd wish. So anyway, it has been asked, if a singer doesn't write their own tunes, does that make them not as good as someone who does? For example, is Shania Twain or Celine Dion not as good as Joni Mitchell simply because they don't write their own material? Does Pavarotti suck because he doesn't write operas, for example? While these are fair questions, I think they're also somewhat red herrings. For me, the issue has always been, and I mean always, regardless of genre, regardless of label or content or style, the quality of the music and the quality of the performance, irregardless of other factors. I never liked Kiss, ever, simply because the stage antics struck me as boring, and the music just wasn't any good. No one ever said Kiss was great musically, at least most people don't claim that, and other... I've heard a few people who have claimed that Kiss was the greatest band ever, but most of them were still playing music in their garage in their parents' house or in the basement. But anyway, the entertainment factor, be it a live show or whatever, just doesn't cut it for me if the music isn't that good. Great stage performers know that the theatrics are meant to enhance the experience, not replace an element that is not so strong. I went to a show in Madison once where Primus opened for Rush. These are two well-known progressive rock bands. I had a great time all through the Primus's opening set, but I left 3 songs into Rush, which, according to some of my friends, is total heresy to do, because I was totally bored. I guess I just didn't get it. Primus just played, and they rocked, and they had no stage theatrics, they just did their music. Rush had a multimedia light show and big theater screen behind them, showing little movies and so forth, and it just didn't do anything for me. Staging effects are there to enhance the experience. That is also why some live performances of great music push past greatness into the sublime. When King Crimson did their mid-1990s tour, and I saw them in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the stage lighting was brilliant. When they got to the quiet instrumental middle section of a piece called One Time, the lights moved out over the audience, sparkling like fireflies, and including the audience in the musical moment. And it made my spine tingle. It was so amazing. So I don't mind being called elitist, and the real issue for me is always about the quality of the music itself. The other stuff has always seemed to me to be beside the point. It's nice, but if the music isn't holding my attention, the staging probably won't either. So, yes, there's subjective judgment involved in these labeling processes. As the saying goes, one man's religion is another man's belly laugh. However, I do think that while one can talk about the relativistic ideas about what's great music, I think it's a mistake to go all the way into total relativism. One can live and let live, and I'm perfectly happy to let the folks who like the bands that I don't like Kiss, go out and have a great time and have a terrific show. More power to you. But then, does it only come down to personal taste? Well, I don't think so. I'm not going to make a moralistic argument about relativism, so relax. However, even in this morass of postmodernism that we live in today, which in fact I as an artist participate in and contribute to, I think that one may still make some distinctions between intrinsic quality and individual taste. Granted, this is much harder to do in music than in, say, poetry or painting, because music is a more ephemeral, nonverbal, and intrinsically kinesthetic pre-verbal art form than are these others. I maintain, however, that good artistic creations in different media and genres have more in common with each other than they do with not-so-good artistic creations within the same media and genre, and that there can be some reasonably objective criteria for making assessments about relative quality. I'm not entirely clear as to what those criteria might be, as I grant the partial relativism of the question and do allow for personal taste, but that such criteria in some way do exist, I have no doubt. I still struggle to articulate what they are, though. So, what do good artistic creations have in common? Well, think about it. How do they affect us, the perceiver? Getting back to how one responds to a musical performance. A great performance lingers. We remember it. It sends a thrill through us and a tingle up our spine. Good artistic performances make us suddenly alert to every detail where before we felt foggy or even asleep. Sudden clarity about some aspect of being alive suddenly comes into our perception. The ancient Greeks wrote about being suddenly entered by the daemon, which is the spirit of life and self. They talked about it actually in the terms of being entered by the god, dealing with whichever god they were talking about at the time. Such aesthetic experiences create a sense of inherent life or immanence that other artworks by comparison do not. They remind us of who we are as conscious beings. They emphasize our humanity, and we come back to re-experience them. We come back to them to remember who and what matters in life. And some of this is contextual, of course. We may not all be moved at the same time by the same things, and that's where that question of taste and legitimate sense of relative quality comes in. But the fact is that we are all moved at some time in some way. So this goes beyond simple entertainment, which is usually thought of as a quantitative commodity upon which thinking the music industry bases many of its assumptions about what is commercially viable, i.e. sellable. And I think enters the realm of, dare I say it, feeling personally connected to something that transcends our individual sense of self. What we perceive of as great art links us together more than it sets us apart. This sort of experience exists in opposition to those forces that seem to suck the life force out of us, or leave us so unmoved as to feel nothing. Remember, the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. If you passionately hate an artist's work, then that is a negative attachment, just as loving it is a positive attachment. But to say that it is all taste and all personal choice begs the issue. If it is also purely subjective, then why bother at all? Why do we even care? At the ultimate point of this argument, no sharing is possible because there is only subjectivity and only what the self perceives. This is sheer solipsism, the philosophical stance which at its extreme leads to nihilism because only I exist and nothing else is real. That route leads to despair and disconnection, and I think alienation and even abuse, which is precisely the opposite of what shared aesthetic experiences in great art do. They show us what we have in common as human beings. So without being at this time able to articulate precisely what it is that makes great music great, I feel that our common responses to it are part of the equation. This does not defeat all forms of relativism or even those versions of relativism oft cited by postmodernists, but it does create a virtual space wherein some shared aesthetic experiences are acknowledged to exist. Wherever 2 or 3 people gather together to agree that a concert rocked, then there is some kind of common experience. As for criteria that are conceivably more objective on the level of craft and execution, while there are obvious exceptions, in general, bad playing just isn't going to be as memorable as good playing. A bad version of a great song can, as we all know, kill the song. A great performance by a great artist can transform a mediocre song into a memorable artistic experience. Again, context matters. None of us are playing in the zone at every single gig, for example, so some nights will be better than others. Maybe the common factor is that when we're playing in the zone, we transcend. Again, the Greeks in their daemon. We transcend the mundane, the everyday, the humdrum, make it come alive, and being alive, taking on its own life, remind us that we too are alive as living, breathing human beings. Why is Billie Holiday a better artist than Kiss? Perhaps it comes down to the experience that Billie moves more of the person than does Kiss. Peter Gabriel, for example, openly admits that he writes what he calls crotch songs on occasion, songs such as Sledgehammer or Steam or Shock the Monkey, and that these are usually his least interesting songs over time, even while they are the ones most promoted by the music industry. Probably because they're crotch songs, they're more sellable. Sex sells. Every marketing person knows that. So Kiss may be great entertainment, but will they stand the test of time as musicians? I very much doubt it. Only time can tell in the end, however. The music industry does understand and know how to promote and sell entertainment, but really it has no idea how to sell music. I don't think anyone does. So I agree that the overexposure and desensitization problem, which have been mentioned with regard to people being overmarketed, like the ubiquitousness of, say, Britney Spears, well, I don't think that's much of a problem in the end. People do know the difference between the great quality music and the entertainment stuff, even as they go for entertainment this weekend on their Friday night show. There are sociocultural reasons beyond ignorance that have an impact on the popularity of entertainment over art. They called it bread and circuses in ancient Rome. When the people are living in difficult times, in dangerous times, many folks will seek to be distracted from their daily problems rather than have to directly deal with them, and entertainment has always been a major source of distraction. So you want to blow off steam and aren't looking for anything profound this Friday night? So what? No worries. Have a good time. The sociocultural trend only becomes a problem when distraction and denial become the dominant form of addressing social problems, which one could argue is going on right now in the world today. Nothing more distracting than a war. Anyway, again, calling one genre art and another genre entertainment misses the point. Great pieces and lesser pieces exist in all media and all genres. Lots of folks know that Britney Spears isn't great and won't be around in a few years. So what? The reason the industry puts forward a newly manufactured pop icon every few years is that there are always new, young, naive, inexperienced listeners who buy records. It's called exploitation marketing, folks, and it's a very old commercial strategy. The difference between entertainment and art may only be in the area of which sets out to be explicitly exploitational because, again, entertainment is quantifiable, while the alternative is much less so. I'm left with one final analogy on the topic of how we can come up with some criteria that avoids total relativism. This is an excerpt from the autobiography of a contemporary mystic who, after decades in a monastery, left church and dogma and orthodoxy all behind to become what he calls a monk at large in the world. And I quote, "Despite differences of expression, the information of the mystics is essentially identical in East, West, and everywhere else in the world where persons of deep inwardness have reported their experiences and highest realizations. In widely varying storing forms that rise from different cultural frames of reference and different languages, they share what they have seen and experienced, and it all comes out to be the same experience, the same insight. What they report is striking in its similarity. From their common human spirit, the common spiritual hunger broke through everywhere to a common awareness." End quote. That was from George Fowler's book, Dance of a Fallen Monk. So along these lines, there's also been a lot of recent talk, post-Napster and other point-to-point file-sharing software systems exploding on the scene a few years ago. There has been a lot of talk that the music industry is fighting a last-ditch battle to suppress the explosion of availability of file swapping on the internet because they're old dinosaurs that can't adapt. Adapt or die. If they collapse, the international distribution of music and global Disneyfication of culture would collapse, leading to a new prevalence of local, regional, and small music scenes popping up all over. I think that a return to local and regional music making could only be healthy for the state of music itself overall, and would very definitely shift us back towards art from mere entertainment. I guarantee that a coffee house music scene would immediately spring up in every community that agreed to turn off their TVs at night. The hunger for new music among the average folk hasn't really changed. What's changed, supported by the advent of the whole post-industrial revolution technical culture, is how music gets disseminated, the media, and the desire for new content. Has been mentioned by many times before by many different sources, the economy of scale and too much concentration of the decision level control in the hands of too few persons or corporations is why the music industry has become what it has. I'm all for a total failure or collapse, whatever you want to call it, of the current state of the music industry as being a way to clear the earth for a new renaissance. But will it actually happen that way? Stay tuned to your local war to find out.
Well, Art, in listening to your piece there, I've often said you should write some more essays because I know that was just an email that you had sent off to some
musicians
online
list
group
that I belong to online. Yeah.
But the basic thrust seems to be the idea of objectivity versus subjectivity, and this is a kind of endless debate people have. And I've always been of the opinion, and you are from this piece that if people always want to talk about something as subjective, well, what the hell is the point of arguing?
Well, there's nothing to talk about after a while because everybody has their own opinion, and that's all fine. You can all get along and live and let live, but then there's no conversations. Yeah,
my wife Jessica always says that the only people who ever talk about subjectivity are bad artists.
Oh, you think? Oh, I hadn't heard that before.
One of the things that came to mind in listening to you talk on art there was I have this idea, I don't know if you'd call it a theory or hypothesis, that I call the divine inspiration fallacy, and we talked a little earlier about why artists are jealous? Is it just basically a lack of self-esteem or whatnot? But I've got this idea that people tend to buy into this idea of the artist as sort of the tuning fork or the antenna for something greater that comes in, whereas I believe myself I'm the progenitor of whatever I do, good, bad, or indifferent. But if most artists do subscribe to the theory that there's this well of creativity out in the ether there, that when divine inspiration strikes, they're pulling something down or they're getting something from something higher, I think that's one of the reasons that people have some jealousy, because if there's something out there and you have pulled it down, well, there's less out there for them, and they feel that you're taking something away. Whereas I think if a person believes that it's coming from their soul, their mind, their creativity
from within, yeah,
that there isn't going to be that inherent jealousy. And I don't think I've ever, I mean, not trying to say that I'm you, but I don't think I've ever heard artists really talk about that. But to me, that seems a pretty, I think, obvious thing, or a pretty good hypothesis as to why there is such petty bickering.
It's possible. I mean, the whole jealousy thing is an ongoing thing, and has been for probably millennia. I can't think of a single time, because it's part of human nature. The thing about whether it's out there and you pull it in, and you know, it's sort of like you're sucking the well dry and not leaving enough for others. I think that there are probably some people who genuinely do believe that, and I think those are the same people who also believe that, you know, if I get a job that they don't get, then it's to their detriment, because that's just one less job for them to get. Whereas, you know, maybe in fact, if it all comes from within, then there's a limitless supply. And, you know, I've got a well inside me, you've got a well inside you, everyone else has got a well inside them. So maybe the problem comes down to not really whether or not you're depriving the well, you know, you're sucking the water out of a communal well, as to whether or not you have a good enough bucket, you know, or a good enough antenna to work with.
On our second show, we're going to have a poet from France named James Emmanuel, and he's little known in this country, but he's a really good poet, and I think I'll try to revive some of this idea when we speak to him. Mm-hmm. But it occurs to me, too, that another pattern that artists seem to fall into, and I know a lot about poetry, but I'm, you know, basically just a layperson when it comes to reading about other arts. But it seems most arts tend to fall into this pattern that people revile the people who really make a difference, the people who are innovators and push the boundaries of the art form that are their contemporaries. Yet, a generation or two later, the people that are worshipped are those innovators, but they're worshipped by the people on the inside whose counterparts in the innovators' contemporary scene revile them. And meanwhile, they revile their own innovators. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts on to why that pattern we can go back centuries and that seems to not vary?
I mean, there's a whole Nicholas Slonimsky, I think in the 50s, wrote this wonderful book called A Lexicon of Musical Invective, which is about 4 centuries of bad reviews of classical music that we think are the greatest things since sliced bread now. You know, Beethoven's terrible reviews, Bach's terrible reviews, all that stuff. So this is an age-old thing. I'm not really sure if that's ever going to change, because I think that you always have, within any given time frame, you have the group of people who are looking to the future and the people who are looking to the past. Neither of them are really living in present time, I might add. But the people who look to the future are the ones who are interested in new music and new art and new painting and new techniques and new technology, including things like the internet. And they're often on the bleeding edge of innovation. And I say bleeding edge because that's even further out than cutting edge in my opinion. And then there's always the people who are, I don't want to use the word conservative because that has other connotations, but I think that they're more interested in what's already been done, or they're more interested in the familiar, or perhaps they're just genuinely afraid of change and innovation. I think maybe it might be a mix of all of those things. It's certainly true that the people who tend to control the quantifiable aspects of art, music, and poetic industries, like the publishers and the music labels and things like that, tend to be inherently conservative because, hey, this worked, let's do it again. So they want to go for tried and true principles because they're actually not interested in promoting art. They're actually interested in making money. And I think that's the fundamental difference between people who are interested in innovation and people who are not when it comes to how art is disseminated into the world through those normal channels. Now, that's breaking down, I think, and the current issue of Wired magazine is talking about the fall of the music industry as a possibility within the next 5 to 10 years, largely due to the internet and CD burning and MP3 file sharing and that kind of thing. And I think what we're dealing with here is a whole new way of people connecting with it. I know professional musicians who sell almost 100% of their CDs either at their gigs or over the internet and are making a living doing it and are not signed with a major label. Major labels don't even know they exist and wouldn't promote them if they did because their stuff is too different. And yet they're making a living and doing what they're doing. So I think we're in the middle of a whole new paradigm shift here that's brought on by this technology, but it's just, in terms of the innovation, I think it's just a more extreme case rather than a different thing in kind.
Earlier I had mentioned that I think most people, we live in a sort of C+ world. Yet I've always had a sneaking suspicion that most people, artistic or not, tend to at a fundamental level know themselves, maybe not intellectually realize it, but a person who might write Mother Goose ditties doesn't really believe that they could be a Walt Whitman, doesn't really believe they could be a Blake or fill in whoever you think is a great, but they put on, I think, a front, because I know whenever I've seen someone connect with art, and when I've read poems and you can see pupils dilate, people attention more, give you more attention. I've seen it with other artists when they're rapt. There's a different reaction, and yet those artists that aren't that good don't get that. And to me, they'd almost have to be zombies not to recognize that. And so I think they may not be able to quantify it in their minds, but I think at a gut level, people have to know that artist A is, a great artist. Artist B is a good journeyman, and artist C should be baking cookies. Yeah,
I don't know. It's possible. I do believe that everybody can sense that stuff, whether they can articulate it or not. And I do think that that's when I was talking in my essay earlier about that kind of personal experience. Does the performance, does the piece, does the poem, does the painting grab you? Does it grip you and won't let you go and you can't forget about it? And that, to me, right there is one of those things that it's really hard to talk about, whether it's quantifiable or not. And at the same time, something happened. You may not be able to know what it was, but something did happen in that moment.
I know one of the ideas that we've kicked around for a show topic was chaos, and you talked about a fellow who does some music based in that. And I was wondering too, in terms of depth and whatnot, I've always thought that there's a surface kind of reality. Then people tend to always look for things, whether it's religion or art, for that deeper look.
Right.
And then I think a lot of things, though, are not really that deep. I mean, when I look around just the more prosaic living, most of the problems that I see that are in people's lives are generally caused by themselves or whatever their failures are. And I think just as with, I had mentioned the divine inspiration fallacy, that in pulling through that, people like to push out their problems and blame it on the outside world. And I'm just wondering if the difference between maybe an artistic person or a creative person, whether that's a scientist or an artist, and someone who might have a little bit of creativity but goes to a Kiwanis club, if the difference is maybe just the difference between, if you want to the difference in like a radio frequency, that if you move down the dial a little bit, they're not differences in kind but degree. Maybe.
Yeah, it may just be differences in degree. I do think that there's one other kind of difference in degree going on there, and that's how honest people are with themselves and how responsible they are for their own actions and how willing to be responsible they are versus, blaming God versus, if I'd turned right instead of left, things might have been better. Instead, I'll blame God. Sometimes there's a lot of that kind of projection going on, too. But at the same time, I think it's really important to have some kind of, I don't know, maybe this isn't true, but, there are artists who have talked about the fact that the only reason they're doing art is because they can't do anything else, because they're no good at doing anything else. And And then there's another group of artists that talk about the fact that they feel a compulsion, that if they weren't doing this, they'd be insane, or they'd be or locked up, or they'd be out there on a rooftop with a high-powered rifle sniping at people, because it's the only thing that keeps them going in life. And I think those are all part of that too. I'm not sure that that's differences in kind, though, like you were talking about before.
Well, I guess just to wrap up this sort of commentary on your piece, you had mentioned honesty, and I was thinking too, whenever I've argued with people, whether it's on religion or in the arts, I've always found that people don't mind being wrong if they think you're being dishonest with them, but if they feel that they're losing an argument in a fair fight, they hate you even more, because because then they don't have an excuse. I mean, whether you're arguing about an artist or you're arguing about their belief systems, political or religious, and I guess that's a large topic that maybe with some of these other people, because I know in a future show we're hoping to have we're going to have Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan on, and I'd like to find out their views in science, because I'm sure that a lot of this stuff that we talk about in the arts, jealousy and whatnot, is just as rampant in science. And
yeah, I think ego is everywhere, and I think jealousy is everywhere too.
Yeah. This is Dan Schneider, and in this next segment we're going to be hearing a little bit of an oral essay from a local writer that I've known for a few years, as well as Art Durkee. He has come to the Uptown Poetry Group, but basically he's a fiction writer. He has a website called www.storysouth.com, and he's originally from Dixie, and its main goal is to promote the writings, poetry, and fiction of Southern writers. And Jason is going to read a little bit of an oral essay, don't think NPR, but a little bit of an oral essay on the miniaturization of literature. Welcome, Jason, from across in South Minneapolis, and go ahead.
The world's smallest essay on the coming miniaturization of literature. The other day, a well-known author was asked that oft-asked and irritating question, "What advice do you have for new writers?" Her reply, "Make sure that what you have to say is worth reading, because our libraries are being filled up by minutia." According to industry statistics, more books than ever are being sold, but these massive sale numbers are being reached because of fewer and fewer authors. Stephen King, John Grisham, Nora Roberts, forget all others. Minutia, noun, a minute or minor detail. When Ann Gedoff, the respected head of Random House, was recently fired, it wasn't because she hadn't made money for her corporate bosses. It was because she hadn't made tons and tons and tons of money. Forget the mid-list, those books that sell around 10,000 copies and take years to find a readership. Forget that the mid-list is precisely where the heart and soul of literature lives, or lived. If James Joyce were alive today, Ulysses would be a mid-list book. But why would anyone publish it when they could instead make a fortune off the new Tom Clancy novel? Minutia on minutia. The word minutia dates from around 1751, right smack in the middle of the scientific revolution. The old joke about scientists is that scientific specialists learn more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing, while scientific generalists learn less and less about more and more until they know nothing about everything. The scientific revolution changed how people thought about themselves. Human knowledge became abstract. Truth could be empirically tested, proved, disproved. The world was seen as a giant machine and could be broken down into tiny pieces, into minutia. The most given advice in MFA creative writing programs: show, don't tell. The world is growing smaller every day, and it's not in the "it's a small world" vision of Walt Disney or the "we're all neighbors in the interconnected web of life" of tree huggers. Instead, it's becoming more and more possible to find out anything about everything. Want to know if God exists? Type the request into a search engine. You'll get 1 million different places promising God's address on a silver platter. Why read literature to understand the world when you can just Google it instead? second most given advice in MFA programs. Write what you know. Here's what I know about the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution began with Nicholas Copernicus saying that the sun is the center of the solar system. Along the way, Isaac Newton went from apples to gravity, Charles Darwin evolved, Albert Einstein discovered that we're all energy, and Dr. Johannes Salk produced a polio vaccine. That's all I know about the scientific revolution. None of it is minutia. The top scientific story of 2002, as decided by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The discovery that molecules called small RNAs control much of a gene's behavior. Now, I don't doubt that the discovery is true, or that it will one day change our lives, but you would have to be a genetic expert to understand any of that. Does this mean that the science which now shapes our lives on a daily basis will never be understood by more than a few experts? Just as fewer and fewer people understand scientific discoveries, fewer and fewer people read literature. Soon, most authors will be writing their stories and poems for fellow writers and a few select readers. Imagine the scientific peer review system, where scientists write about their discoveries in language that can only be understood by other scientists. Now apply this to literature. But of course, literature is already a peer review system. When was the last time you walked up to an airport magazine stand and bought a copy of the Southern Review? No one reads literary journals, except for writers wanting to be published in literary journals. One final minutia. The well-known author from the star of the essay is not famous. Her books are rarely read outside of the literary world, but writers know her. And she swears she was misquoted in her response to that oft-asked and irritating question, what advice do you have for new writers? Her true response? Make sure that what you have to say is worth reading, because our libraries are being filled up by the minute. Nothing ever really fills up. There's always room for more minutia.
Well, Jason, thanks for that essay. I guess it's we might call it the Oprahfication of culture. Is there anything you want to give a plug for your website? Because we're going to have you back, hopefully on each show to do little oral essays and maybe even secure some good prose writers for us. But you want to tell us a little bit about Story South that I didn't mention? Yeah,
I mean, it's a literary journal, so I'm sitting here and slamming literary journals in my essay. But the truth is that what literary journals should be doing is trying to promote new writers, and because it's kind of a proving ground. But the problem is that all the big literary journals don't do that. All they do is keep recycling the well-known and the famous literary writers who nobody reads, and all the academics, and it gets kind of boring and monotonous. So we're trying to do something new, and I think I'm really proud of the fact that we have probably published the most new writers of any literary journal out there, and we're getting some attention for it.
But are they good? They can be new all they want, but they have to be good too.
Yeah, exactly. And I try to pick the best fiction. And I don't really care if someone's been published or not. If they got a damn good story, that's all I care about.
Well, would you publish Stephen King if he submitted, though?
It was a damn good story.
If it was a good story. Okay, that's fair.
Okay, well,
yeah, I mean, to be honest, Stephen King can write some amazing short stories.
But
his longer fiction, it doesn't tend to, it's commercialized, but he puts some effort into the short stuff.
Or if somebody had the guts to edit him.
Well, of course, yeah. Maybe that's, and it's easier, perhaps, someone, I don't know about, maybe they edit the shorter stuff, I don't know. But,
well, thanks for your contribution, Jason, and hopefully people who tune into all the various shows will hear a whole diversity of your opinions on things literary and non. So thanks again for Jason Sanford, www.storysouth.com. Good night, Jason.
Have a good night.
I'm going to now read an essay that I posted last summer on Cosmoetica.com, and it's about an incident that happened a few years ago with my then fiance, now wife, and it's entitled Buddhism as Business. A couple of years ago, my then fiance, now wife, Jessica, had a visit from a college pal of hers named Angie. Angie visited for a few days, and we planned a trip to the town of Stillwater, Minnesota. This little town is famed for its historic main street lined with nice eateries and dozens of antique shops. It is often busy on normal weekends, but on this weekend it had one of its 3 or 4 annual festivals. I don't recall which one, but I believe we went in spring. Nonetheless, it was a pleasant afternoon and evening. It would have been just another of the dozens or thousands of such memories whose details quickly fade from one's mind for lack of any singular memory, especially since Jess and I have gone there on a number of occasions. However, this time there was an incident. As Jess and Angie went off to browse through the back of one of the shops, I decided to plop myself down in the front of a nice indoor fountain with 2 benches. Then it happened. That day I had seen a swarm of Tibetan Buddhists in town. It seems there was a convention or something, for several dozen head-shaven monks in pale pink robes with bright maroon sashes were wandering all over town, some barefoot and some in sandals. A trio of them entered the shop where I was cooling my dogs. One was an old man, one was middle-aged, and one in his mid-20s. The younger one asked if they could sit with me. I said that was fine. Apparently the young monk was the only one who could speak English. After a minute or two of exchanged nods and smiles, he started asking me things about my life, where I lived, etc. So we conversed, as the 2 older monks babbled to each other in whatever tongue was their natal patois. The young monk, whose name I forget and could not easily pronounce, soon got talking on typically philosophical things. Having once allowed a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses into my home just to flirt with a cute young female and make her feel dirty, I decided to humor the benevolent ascetic. Now, I'm not one who shares the Western liberal intellectual orgasmic fetish for all things Eastern or Aboriginal being superior to that in the West. This inevitably leads to a Campbellian pseudo-intellect, Blivian tamburining, and a general idiocy in supposed intelligent people. I hate all religion. I'm an anti-religionist, Jew, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Taoism, Buddhism, etc., because despite their protestations to the contrary, all religion fundamentally seeks the herd mindset, even those Eastern religions that claim the opposite, lest they would leave no codes behind, eh? Nonetheless, the good swain had chosen his poison, so I was happy to, with good cheer and better intentions, show up his folly. After the usual blather about being at one with things, peace, nature, animism of sorts, it was my turn. I counted that I did not take issue that a lot of what he said might be true, but to me it was simply irrelevant. I lived by my own code of scruples, an ethos of one. Then I asked him how he became a monk. After pausing to think about it, after all, he had just said to me that his religion was so manifest that to not be a monk was to not be himself. Still, he revealed that he was a 7th or 8th generation monk. It was in effect the family business, a curiously Western thing. Apparently, he came from a non-celibate sect. After a brief interchange of ideas and queries, I asked him when he decided monkdom was for him. He first said some young age, 5 or 6, but then I questioned that any child could have the reason to choose their life's path at such an age. So he recanted. Upon reflection, he mused that it had always been a given that the oldest men in his family would become monks. I could see a slight agitation in his mien as this realization seemed to sink in for the first time in a long time, if ever. I granted that there was nothing wrong with his monkish profession, if that's what he truly believed in, but his eyes were different now. It was as if something fundamental had changed. I don't think it was my own wishful thinking either. He went silent for a while after this notion took root. Despite what decades of liberal arts and humanities apparatchiks would have us believe, there's no real root difference in both the ways and workings of the Eastern and Western thought systems, merely gradations and slight intonations. He did not say whether the 2 older monks, oblivious to our conversation and wrapped by Western knick-knackery, were related to him, but he seemed to look at them differently. I tried to assuage his growing discomfort by saying that almost all men in some fashion seek to emulate their fathers, and that he and his clan had merely carried this emulation to its logical end, short of injecting themselves with their forebears' DNA. The young monk smiled and changed the subject. He was very polite, and to a casual observer seemed no different than a few minutes earlier when he had engaged a strange pale American in pleasantries. Jess and Angie were heading back to the front of the shop, so I said my goodbye to all 3, but especially to the young monk, who seemed to be growing a distress by the minute. I had not intended to cause him pain, yet a part of me hopes that he saw some greater truth. although I cringe to say that. Perhaps he has since decided to pursue something else, especially if he had prior qualms about his profession. Too many people simply do what is expected. They do not follow their own instincts. They give up or in, then suffer a muffled existence until death. Too often the primary cause of this sort of suffocating is religion of one sort or another. People do not seem to realize that religion is merely myth up close and the myth is discarded religion. There's no physical nor historical evidence of a Jesus. Most of Muhammad's life has been bowdlerized. Siddhartha is shrouded in myth, and little supports the existence of Moses, who seems to have been a retelling of the old Gilgamesh myth through several twists and turns. Gilgamesh, a real figure whose life was twisted into religion before settling into mythos. Yet religion tells people it has all the answers, even if the answers are look for the questions, as so much non-Western thought does. It's just a shell game to strip individuals of their intellect, to remove wonder from the real and plant it in the nebulous. Poor folk like that young monk often do not even know that they have been grafted onto something. Hopefully he's questioning these sort of things. To me, the greatest wonder of all is to see things with an absolute clarity. Only then can one really appreciate the grandeur and magic of the cosmos. Only then can one truly amaze at the intricacy and splendor of the everyday, free of the mythos and religiosity that suckles our fears. It is a human desire, if not a need, to fabulate on what is grander, when presented with the raw, and the reasons why all stem from the lack of self-esteem that all religions vamp off of, even the vaunted Buddhism, which is just like any other family business, for better or worse. This is not so much to condemn that faith as evil, as to recognize it as part of the little evils humans daily succumb to, so not to be lost in bother and to accomplish things. It is only when this is recognized and accepted can the true will to change be genuine. This is not to say that such change is without pain, sacrifice, agitation, but the rewards of dealing with the real are so much greater. But don't accept what I say as the final word. No, find out for yourself. Ask yourself the kind of question or questions I asked the young Buddhist. Perhaps you will not know his confusion. If you do, embrace it and go find out some other shit for yourself. Otherwise, you might as well go find an antique store to sit in and wait till they mark your price down. And that's it.
So, Dan, I know a few people in the New Age movement who would listen to that story and say, and I admit that some of these people are recovering Catholics, so they would probably think this way anyway. Well, anyway, they would say that, well, you were put there by God to have this guy question his faith and either be tested and decide that, hey, it's not for me, and move on, or become deeper in his faith. So, you know, in that angle, it's sort of the whole idea that everything is meant to happen and you were there for him, even though it didn't seem to make any sense. What do you think about that idea?
Well, I think that just gets to the whole idea of faith. And, I had mentioned earlier, I've been arguing with some online people who have a religious bent. And I'm the whole thing, I think, gets down to this idea of free will, or if there is some kind of omnipotent deity. I mean, if you have a truly omnipotent deity, then there is no such thing as free will. There just logically can't be, I don't think. And, I really don't think there was... I can't subscribe to believing that I'm just a tool to improve someone's life, or he was a tool to improve my life had it worked out differently. That's a very kind of ad hoc reasoning that I think goes into most religious people once they get to a cliff and they can't go any further. Yeah.
Well, it's just a thought that occurs to me. One of the interesting things about Buddhism that I know from around the world is that not all cultures have celibate monks. In fact, the whole celibacy thing, I think, is a uniquely Western idea, and very, very. Not even the Russian Orthodox or the Eastern Orthodox priests are celibate. It's only basically the Western Catholic priests that are celibate. Nobody else is. I mean, I think that's very interesting to bring that up, how he might have been, generations and generations of monks in the same family.
Well, it just shows how inculcated into, this culture that I am, because, I basically, the whole idea of asceticism, which I always relate with monks of whatever faith, I guess assumed would be carry over into the sexual abstinence as well. Mm-hmm. So that did take me by surprise, but it was one of those experiences that was just very interesting, because he did seem to be, at least externally, genuinely a believer in whatever his faith was. But it was just very odd when I mentioned that it seemed like, from what he said, it was a family business, and I don't think he ever thought of that. And I just think of how many other times I've met very religious people, and whether you're arguing on abortion or homosexuality or
whatever,
or Big Bang versus creationism, evolution, etc., that I guess for me the thing that drives me away from most religion is I can't close off that questioning part of myself. And to me, the thing that separates, or one of the major things that separates human beings from I guess chimpanzees or the lower, if you want to term them as that, animals, is that we question things. We have this curiosity which drives us, and to me, religion is a kind of snuffing out of that. Yet it's odd too, because a lot of the people I meet who claim to have faith, are always questioning, and I guess it's the whole AA thing that I've always found kind of hypocritical. Is I can certainly accept something greater than myself. You just have to look around. But on the other hand, change is always going to come from within, and it gets back to this idea I had mentioned earlier about whether you tune in creativity from outside or whether it's generated from from within. And I've always, for better or worse, I guess I've always stepped up to the plate, and when I failed, and when I've done well, I'm not ashamed to pat myself on the back.
Okay. Sounds good to me. Topics, if not style,
Yeah. So
All right, you are rolling, my friends.
Okay.
Well, in this little segment, we've talked about art, and we've talked about politics, and we've talked about religion, and maybe in this little segment we can just tie all three together a little bit. I call a lot of the mass communication what I call the bastardization of language, and I've written an essay, and I've talked with Art and other people I know about it. I really dislike the way that terms, especially political terms, are bandied about, specifically liberal, conservative, and libertarian. I don't think that most liberals are really truly liberal. I don't think that most conservatives are truly conservative, and I don't think that most libertarians, most distressing to myself since that's where I tend to gravitate, are really libertarians. And just to use like the three brief examples, political correctness in the last 15, 20 years or whatever, is basically de facto censorship, and I don't see how anyone who calls themselves a liberal or has a liberal mindset could want to stifle any kind of debate. Similarly, any conservative, it always amazes me how someone who considers themselves a conservative would want to be against abortion, or would want to care what happens in someone's bedroom, be it abortion or whether it's homosexuality or whatnot.
Yeah.
And libertarians, I find most distressing, because to me, a libertarian, there's the silent civil that comes before libertarian. Yet most libertarians tend to these days, and certainly the Libertarian Party, tend to shill for corporations. That libertarian, that it's not civil liberties, but it's corporate liberties that they seem to value more than.
Well, and they're also shilling for the bullies, a lot of them, because they're the ones who are like, "Hey, I'm the biggest fish in this pond. I can do whatever the hell I want to do." Is often how they come across. Versus, somebody who's a more historical libertarian who actually has some sense of responsibility to the community rather than everything is just about me.
Yeah, and it wasn't really always that way. I think maybe the turning point was maybe in the Eisenhower era, because if I look back, 100 years or so ago, I don't think I could ever vote for a contemporary Republican figure, but I could easily vote for an Abe Lincoln.
Certainly.
I could easily vote for Teddy Roosevelt if they ran.
Always.
But yet, a Roosevelt was a Republican. He in certain ways was a conservative, but he was also a great libertarian. He was also a great basher of those interests that tried to stem civil liberties. And yet, somehow, that has all been reversed. In a lot of ways, some of the most reactionary takes outside of the religious field, field would be from liberals. I think they tend to want to silence voices and they always use the pretext of, well, we're trying to help emerging voices or emerging segments or emerging this, that, or the other thing. And yet it's the old theory of, like, if you topple a dictator, you just replace them with another dictator. They want to impose their own set of morals or ethics, and it's a mirror image of the thing they hate.
I have this analogy that I use, and I think that some of this is a historical period we're going through that may not last much longer, I hope, because it's certainly turbulent enough right now. But I have this analogy that I use is that, if it's like in a clock that runs off a pendulum, like a grandfather clock, the pendulum swings all the way to one side and then it comes all the way over to the other side and then back and forth and gradually winds down as it runs out of energy and ends up somewhere in the middle, not oscillating so wildly. So sometimes I do think that you get reactionary types on both the left and the right, and sometimes even in the middle in other directions too. The problem is people are being reactionary and responding to what their so-called opponents are putting forward rather than actually coming up with anything that's not a response. So it ends up being this table tennis match versus, actually sitting down and talking and maybe we could actually turn off and go off in a totally new direction that might not have anything to do with the existing table tennis top.
I have no problem with criticizing people, and I genuinely enjoy dialectic. But one of the things that always frustrates me, whether you're talking politics, religion, art, whatever the theme of the day is that if you're going to criticize, you have to, I think, put forth some kind of alternative.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
I think most of the arguments, certainly in things like talk radio, certainly in things like the Roundhead Sunday morning TV shows that you see.
Or like those conservative radio hosts where the only people who get on the air are the people who agree with the host.
Well, but I have to say, one of the things that annoys me about when I listen to NPR too is quite often when something doesn't jibe with whatever the belief system of the host is, they also tend to put it off. And there's a soundbite kind of quality, and it's like people do not want to talk or have actual conversations. And I mean, it's very puzzling. You would talk too. It's very odd. You had mentioned a week or so ago how with the rise of word processing, how most writing has just become such blather and it's not edited.
Yeah.
Yet, to the other degree, most of media, whether it's Dan Rather or the major news, there's no long form documentaries even more that television does. Everything is to the lowest common denominator.
Snippets. And Jason was talking about that in his essay about the miniaturization of literature too. Stumbling over my mouth there. Sorry. The whole thing is about, in some ways, what's commercial. Unfortunately, one of the pressures that makes those news broadcasts so tight and so we don't get good documentaries is all that airtime costs money, so they have to sell commercials to do it. I'm talking about commercial radio now versus what we're doing here, or versus some of the alternative radio or community radio stations, which actually I think still do some of this. You get somebody talking for 5 minutes on a topic versus an hour or an hour and a half on the topic, or having an actual dialogue among 6 people, partly because, we have to move on because we have to, have a commercial in between. And I think it compresses things. And, people have been talking about how the news media, including things like CNN, is really basically infotainment. It's a form of entertainment now. It's not actual in-depth, scholarly, reasonable, let's look at an issue, let's talk about it, or in fact, in many cases, it's not even actual reporting, it's just sound bites again, as you say.
And the other sort of bête noire, other than just sort of the lowest common denominator, soundbite-ization, I guess, of discourse, is how people tend to hide behind, I guess, these code words. And the thing that really angers me is if you're going to state an opinion, and I do this whether I'm criticizing someone's poetry or whether I'm arguing a position pro or con this or that, is I don't have any ulterior motives. I'll give you an example. I had mentioned I I've sometimes there's this online religious group that I've been posting with the last couple of months, and recently they started talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's generally 4 or 5 topics that are bandied about in the group. They sort of personal comments, there's sort of moralistic comments, some Bible quoting, and sort of free-form stuff. And so this was them batting about the idea of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the guy who runs the group was talking about that God was justified in killing the wicked. And the 2 things that struck me as code words in what he was writing about was, number one, I wrote in and asked, well, as far as I know, there was a little simony and gambling in Sodom and Gomorrah, but the basic sex crime was basically sex crimes, prostitution, and sodomy. And so there has been always this sort of coating of homophobia there. And the other term that he used was that God was something to the fact that God was justified in punishing the shiftless. And now anyone who's ever heard the word shiftless, shiftless to me means black. It's that Jim Crow kind of thing, and that's a code word for minorities.
The lazy stereotype thing.
Yeah,
okay.
And so here's an example, and you can find it in online columns. You can find it in a lot of political columns that you can read in newspapers too. Code words like shiftless or to mean a certain minority group, or you don't get the discourse on Sodom and Gomorrah in most mainstream media, but there are always these kinds of code words for this group, that group, or the other group, and yet then there's always this highly offensive. You say, well, we know that what you're meaning. Oh, I'm not a bigot. But because I didn't call him a nigger, I didn't call him a faggot.
I just called him shiftless.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing about that too is a lot of that is based on old translations and old ideas that have sort of accumulated over time, but that have no basis in reality. There's a lot of, for example, on the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing, there's a whole group of biblical scholars now who, as far as I can tell, have no axe to grind other than just to try and get the texts translated as accurately as possible, where it seems among these interpretations that the actual crime of Sodom and Gomorrah was the failure of hospitality and the fact that there was coercion going on, not about, whatever sex or drinking or smoking or whatever was going on, but the way that things were being done, the intention, the motivation, or the total like, hey, I'm gonna get mine and screw you kind of attitude. So that's a whole different take on that. But nobody who talks about Sodom and Gomorrah in the way that you're talking about with the buzzwords or the tags will accept that argument. I've seen people try and convince them of it. Hey, look, this is a more accurate translation, but they don't want to know it's a more accurate translation. They want their ideas already fixed so that they can use their buzzwords as kind of a shorthand or something like that.
Well, I guess just to wrap this section up, you mentioned the magazine Wired, and that brings to mind a Marshall McLuhan, who I think is sort of like the spiritual godfather of that magazine.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how much of that is conscious and how much of that, this use of buzzwords, this oversimplification is a conscious effort on people to misdirect, or is it just an evolution of... I
think a lot of it's evolution and a lot of it's just habituation, bad habits that develop over time. I think McLuhan would say that a lot of it is actually not conscious, but it's sort of almost like programming. It's like you get told that enough times and you sort of click into some part of your brain that says, well, that's what that's about, and then you repeat it back out. So it's a form of received culture, inculturation, acculturation, whatever the anthropological term is for that. McLuhan would probably say that, in fact, most of the times it's thoughtless rather than thoughtful.
But then, how do you account for like spinmeisters like a Karl Rove?
Oh, well, those are just classic manipulators who are basically saying, "Well, hey, I know how to manipulate you because you're an idiot, unwashed mass type person, and I'm this smart, guy who's behind the microphone." There's a lot of cynicism in that whole thing. In fact, I saw in the Onion, that humor magazine out of Wisconsin, I saw an ad or an article not too long ago that said that there's now a 10th circle in Dante's Hell, and it's for spinmeisters and PR people, specifically for them. I thought that was hilarious.
Well, that's certainly a topic that, as we have on tap for future shows, certain journalists maybe, and other people that we can explore in greater detail. So
Great. Okay.
Well, as we head out here on the first edition of the Omniversica radio show, it occurs to me that maybe we didn't exactly set the table right. And so let me just recap or first cap what we're attempting to do here. On this show, we're not National Public Radio, we're not Top 40, we're not talk radio. This is going to be Art Durkee and myself gabbing with each other, gabbing with an assortment of people, sometimes a round table, sometimes interviews, sometimes pre-produced segments, music, poetry, etc. And just to try to see if we can interest people in things beyond necessarily the prosaic, right, Art?
Absolutely. The more out there, the better in some ways. In terms of what my goal is to get people to talk more deeply about things that I think are more interesting than just your average what's on the news tonight thing too.
So we hope you've enjoyed the first edition. Just so you know, if you come back in a month or two, shows number 2 and number 3, this is what we have planned. On show number 2, we're going to be talking with a fellow named James Emanuel. For those who don't know or don't know poetry, you might not know him anyway, because he's a little-known poet, but he's a damn good poet. In fact, I think a great poet. He's an expatriate black American poet that's been living in France for the last 20 years, and we're going to be talking with him on an assortment of things, art, race, etc., as well as talking to his translator, a fellow named Jean Magren.
And we'll have some readings of his poetry and probably a couple produced segments of music with his poetry, too.
And then in our third show, for those of you who grew up watching Cosmos, the TV series on PBS, these two people will probably interest you, because the first person is Lynn Margulis. She's a world-famous biologist. Those of you who have ever looked up or Googled the Gaia theory will know her name. She is the ex-wife of Carl Sagan, but she's also a very influential scientist. I would put her probably in the top 10 or 12 of the last 40 or 50 years, as well as her son, Dorian Sagan, who is a writer and co-contributor with her in her various publications. So that should be very interesting. But one of the things I will stress is we're not going to be asking them, or we're not going to be asking Emmanuel the typical kind of questions that you'll ask. We'll certainly recap their lives, their careers, and their latest projects. But one of the things that I do hope becomes a signature of this show is that you will come here to listen to things that you're not going to hear elsewhere, and whether it's biographical information or just stuff that you haven't heard before, you'll hopefully hear it here.
Hopefully.
So that wraps up the first show, and so thanks to Art, thanks to me, and thanks to Dave Wesley for giving us this opportunity.
And thanks for listening, everybody.
Wow.